He handed over the camp with his own hands. He didn't run, he didn't hide. He walked toward the American soldiers, palms open, ready to surrender peacefully. And within hours, he was dead on the ground, shot without a trial, without a verdict, without even a formal charge read out loud. This is the story of Heinrich Wicker, the last commandant of Dachau, a man who thought surrender would save his life and was wrong in the most brutal way possible. Welcome back to X History. Today we're stepping into one of the darkest, most morally tangled corners of World War II, a moment where the line between justice and revenge disappeared completely. Heinrich Wicker was only 23 years old when he became the final commandant of one of the most infamous concentration camps in human history. But here's the twist nobody talks about. He wasn't even supposed to be in charge. He inherited a nightmare that other men had already built, and then ran away from. Stick with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why American soldiers pulled the trigger on a man who had already raised his hands in surrender, and why historians still argue about it today. Before we go further, if stories like this hit you hard, stories that show the real, raw, human side of history, hit that subscribe button right now. Because on X History, we don't just give you dates and facts, we take you inside the moment so you feel like you're actually standing there. All right. Let's go back to 1933. Heinrich Wicker was just 12 years old when he joined the Hitler Youth. 12. Think about that for a second. A child, barely old enough to understand the world, was already being shaped into a soldier of a regime that would go on to commit some of the worst atrocities in human history. But this was only the beginning of a path that would pull him deeper and deeper into darkness. By 16, Wicker had joined the SS-Totenkopfverbande, the Death's Head units, the men trained specifically to run and guard concentration camps. And where did they send this teenager? Straight to Dachau, the very camp that would later define his life and his death. For the next several years, Wicker wasn't just a bystander. He fought across Europe in the invasions of the Netherlands, Belgium, France, then into the brutal chaos of Operation Barbarossa on the Eastern Front. In February 1942, he was seriously wounded at the Battle of Demayansk, one of the deadliest meat grinders of the entire war. He survived, but survival for Wicker only meant one thing. He'd be sent back into the machinery of the SS, deeper this time into roles that would make him infamous. Because what happened next wasn't on a battlefield. It happened inside camp walls, where Wicker would earn a reputation that prisoners never forgot, and that, years later, would seal his fate in front of a firing line he never saw coming. By late 1943, Heinrich Wicker was no longer just a guard following orders. He had climbed the ranks, trained at the SS Junker schools in Bad Turles, the academy that built SS leaders, and now he wasn't just enforcing brutality, he was designing it. In June 1944, he was handed command of the Bruttig-Treis subcamp, a satellite of the Natzweiler-Struthof camp system. And almost immediately, prisoners noticed something different about him. He wasn't distant. He wasn't just a bureaucrat signing papers from behind a desk. He was present. He was watching. And the men under his control quickly learned to fear him, not because of what he might do, but because of what he had already proven he was willing to do. By December 1944, Wicker took over as commandant of the Mannheim-Sandhofen subcamp, and it's here that we get one of the most chilling details of his entire story, a moment that shows exactly who this man had become. On January 3, 1945, a Polish prisoner named Marian Krański was accused of sabotage inside a factory. Now, in most camps, an execution like this happened quietly, hidden, almost bureaucratically, a name crossed off a list. But Wicker didn't do it quietly. He turned it into a spectacle. He personally invited 5 representatives from Daimler-Benz to come and witness the execution, as if it were some kind of demonstration. As if murder was a lesson to be taught. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't a soldier caught in the chaos of war, killing out of fear or survival instinct. This was a calculated, almost theatrical act of cruelty, carried out by a man barely in his 20s. And it's this exact detail that historians point to when they try to understand what happened to him just 4 months later. Because the way a man treats power when no one is stopping him tells you everything about how his story is going to end. By early 1945, the war was collapsing around Nazi Germany. The Soviets were closing in from the east, the Americans and British from the west, and every SS officer knew, deep down, that the empire they had built was falling apart beneath their boots. And in the middle of that collapse, Wicker was ordered to do something that would define the final chapter of his life: lead a death march. Prisoners were pulled out of the camps ahead of the advancing Allied forces, forced onto brutal marches through freezing conditions, with barely any food, barely any rest, and absolutely no mercy. Under Wicker's command, this march resulted in the deaths of nearly 200 people, 200 human beings who didn't die in battle, who didn't die in a gas chamber. They died walking, starving, freezing, because a young SS officer was following orders to erase evidence before the Allies arrived. And then on April 28, 1945, something happened that changed everything. Wicker's march ended at Dachau, but Dachau wasn't the camp he expected to find. The camp commandant, Martin Weiss, had already fled. The SS staff who were supposed to be running the place had abandoned their posts. There was chaos, panic, disorganization. The entire command structure had collapsed in fear of what was coming. And in the middle of that vacuum, Heinrich Wicker did something almost unthinkable for a man his age and rank. He stepped up, he took command, 23 years old, and suddenly, he was the highest-ranking SS officer left standing at one of the most notorious concentration camps in the world. A camp packed with thousands of prisoners, filled with the evidence of unimaginable atrocities, and surrounded by American forces closing in by the hour. He didn't know it yet, but by taking that command, Wicker had just signed his own death warrant. Because within 24 hours, the very army he was about to face would walk through those gates. And what they would see inside would make sure that no surrender, no white flag, and no plea for mercy would save him. April 29, 1945. The day Heinrich Wicker's entire life came down to a single, irreversible decision. As American troops from the 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions approached Dachau, Wicker made his move. He walked out to meet them personally, alongside a Red Cross representative named Dr. Victor Mora. No weapon raised, no resistance. He formally surrendered the camp to General Henning Linden, offering himself as a prisoner of war under the rules that were supposed to protect surrendering soldiers. For a moment, it must have felt like it was working. He had done everything right, at least by the rule book of war. He raised no gun. He gave no order to fight. He handed over control peacefully. But the rule book of war was about to mean absolutely nothing because of what the American soldiers were seeing behind him. As troops moved deeper into the camp, they found something that no training, no briefing, no warning could have prepared them for. Boxcars packed with corpses, piles of bodies stacked like firewood, survivors so starved they could barely stand, staring back with hollow, disbelieving eyes. This wasn't a battlefield. This was something else entirely, and it broke something in the soldiers who witnessed it. Some prisoners, barely alive, turned on the SS guards who remained, exacting their own brutal justice after years of suffering. But it wasn't only prisoners. American soldiers, consumed by rage and horror at what they'd just uncovered, began executing SS personnel on the spot, men who, only minutes earlier, had already surrendered and were technically prisoners of war. Historians still debate the exact number. Most estimates place it between 35 and 50 SS men killed that day in what's now known as the Dachau Liberation reprisals, though some post-war accounts, later disputed, claim the number was far higher. What almost every account agrees on, though, is this: Heinrich Wicker was among those killed, not in a courtroom, not after a trial, not even in the chaos of active combat. He was killed after surrendering. A summary execution carried out by men who had just seen hell with their own eyes and decided, in that moment, that the rules protecting men like Wicker no longer applied. And here's the haunting part. Wicker's body was never formally identified afterward. No confirmed grave, no official record of the exact moment or method. Just silence, the same silence he had helped create for so many others. So why does this story matter? Almost 80 years later, because it forces us to sit with an uncomfortable question that doesn't have a clean answer. Wicker was undeniably guilty of monstrous things, the death march. The public execution he turned into a spectacle, years of complicity in a system built on suffering. By any measure of justice, he deserved to answer for what he did. But he was killed without a trial, without due process, in the heat of raw human rage rather than through the deliberate weight of justice. And that's exactly why historians still argue about Dachau's liberation to this day, because it sits right on the blurry line between justice and revenge, between accountability and chaos. Heinrich Wicker's story isn't really about one man's death. It's about what happens when the horrors of war strip away the rules that are supposed to separate civilization from vengeance, even for the people enforcing justice. It's a reminder that history isn't always clean. Sometimes the ending isn't satisfying. Sometimes it's just human. If this story moved you, made you think, or even made you uncomfortable, that's exactly what history should do. Subscribe to X History, because we're not done uncovering the moments the world tries to forget.